Okay, good. All right, we have a lot to do today, so let's get started. Last time, as you recall, we were discussing ethical egoism, and we were going through the worksheets that I gave you, and we got most of the way through that, and I want to finish that up and discuss the two remaining arguments against ethical egoism, and then if we have time we'll get started on utilitarianism. But let's review a little bit first on ethical egoism. And we said that is the theory that each person should pursue their own self-interest exclusively. And we should have, at that time, maybe given a couple of examples to reinforce that, I think. Self-interest is somewhat of an ambiguous term. So, for example, if someone is a smoker, they might derive a lot of pleasure from it, and they might think, well, smoking is in my self-interest in that sense. But it's not in their long-term self-interest. So when you think self-interest, do not think simply immediate pleasure. Now, there are forms of egoism that are associated with hedonism that promote that kind of thing as a goal. But we should really think, when we're discussing ethical egoism, in terms of calculated self-interest. That is, self-interest after some kind of reflection. Okay? So, an ethical egoist, by most people's definition of the term, is not likely to think that smoking is really in their self-interest. So they would be opposed to that. All right? I gave you a couple of arguments, pro and con, and these are for the most part just what it says in the text. One of the arguments that Rachel's gives, he says, well, look, one way to defend ethical egoism is simply to say that ethical egoism maximizes the benefits for all. If we all pursue our own self-interest, we will all be better off. As I explained to you last time, that's somewhat of an ambiguous argument. I'm not sure how strong it is, but there is a shift there. This is Rachel's point. There's a shift in emphasis. Originally, we started with looking out for ourselves, but it looks like what really drives this is a concern for the benefit of all, the group. So as long as you are ultimately concerned with an end result of general welfare, you have actually slipped away from ethical egoism per se and shifted into another kind of philosophy. This is Rachel's view. All right. We could say more on that, but let's just move on. I want to get to the last part. And again, to review, Ayn Rand, an extreme form of ethical egoism, which she says, look, altruism, which is very much the opposite of ethical egoism, is a form of self-sacrifice. Now, one thing that I think we should get on deck here, and this occurred to me after some reflection last time as I was reviewing what I said. I don't think, Rachel just assumes you know what altruism is. And the last class I had didn't understand this term. Altruism is the belief that everyone ought, as much as possible, to seek the good of others. So altruism is the belief that everyone ought, as much as possible, to seek the good of others, directly opposed to egoism, which says that everyone ought, as much as possible, to seek the good only of themselves. All right? So that's a very good way for you to understand what ethical egoism is all about, by thinking about what is the direct opposite of it. Well, altruism is. All right? In effect, Ayn Rand is saying altruism is completely wrong. Now, Rachel subjects and says, look, you're making too deep of a contrast between these two things. It's not a choice between we're going to be all altruistic or all self-centered. We can lead a life that attempts to balance the interests of ourselves and the interests of others. That's just a common sense kind of view. All right. So that's the second argument and the response that Rachel gives. And let's finally move on to the last argument. And that is a sort of, you might say, benign form of ethical egoism, in which we assert that, well, ethical egoism is all right because really we can derive all of our duties from the principle of pursuing self-interest. So if we look really at our rational self-interest, if we look at our long-term self-interest, we would engage in charity, we would engage in nonviolent behavior, we would try to keep the society together, we wouldn't lie or cheat because it would make commerce and communication impossible. Okay? And I think Rachel's is right in saying that this is a kind of nice way maybe of putting what ethical egoism might result in. It kind of explains and systematizes our common sense morality. I think what he's really getting at is, all right, but it seems to be based on the wrong principle. I have here, I say, this is a non-threatening, in quotes, form of ethical egoism. And it really rests on expanding the concept of self-interest to include living in a decent society where trust and safety are possible. Okay, so what actually happens here is, again, I think you have a kind of shift from being concerned only with yourself to having another idea in mind about what the ultimate purpose of being moral and ethical is. You want a certain kind of society. Now, this particular problem is reflected in your analysis of the, in your textbook, where, let's see,